For as long as I can remember, I was the ghost in my own home. Not the tragic, mysterious kind people talk about in stories, but the kind no one even notices enough to question. My parents had one daughter, as far as they were concerned, and that daughter was Emily. She was older by 3 years, louder by nature, and for some reason, in their eyes, more worthy of love and attention simply for existing. I stopped trying to understand it a long time ago. Emily was, to put it generously, painfully average. She barely held on to her job at some mid-tier marketing agency that changed names every couple of years. She was constantly playing catch-up on her car payments, missed deadlines like it was a personal hobby, and flitted from one self-inflicted disaster to another like a moth with a broken wing. Yet every Thanksgiving, every birthday dinner, every family barbecue, my parents would sing her praises like she was the second coming of Steve Jobs. They called her our little genius, our fighter, the one who always gets back up. Meanwhile, I sat at the table with a polite smile, trying not to choke on the bile rising in my throat. I didn't just work hard, I excelled. By 26, I had already closed a tech licensing deal that netted me more money than my father had earned in the past 2 years combined. I wasn't just doing okay, I was thriving. I built my own startup from the ground up, negotiated contracts with people twice my age, and spent my nights poring over code, marketing strategies, and pitch decks. But to them, it was just selling stuff. They'd say it with this dismissive tone, like I was hawking bracelets on Etsy or flipping used shoes on eBay. Not that there's anything wrong with either of those things, but it was the way they said it, with that smirk, that condescension, that told me exactly how little they thought of my accomplishments. Once, after signing a particularly lucrative partnership with a major West Coast firm, I told my parents about it during dinner. I'd flown back home just to share the news in person, hoping maybe, just maybe, they'd see me. I explained the scope of the deal, how it would scale my company, how much it meant for my future. My father didn't even look up from his plate. My mother smiled vaguely and said, "Well, good for you, honey. But Emily's thinking about going back to school. Isn't that amazing?" I remember the way my heart physically sank into my stomach, like it had slipped down a set of stairs. I didn't respond. There was no point. Emily, for her part, basked in the glow of their attention like a cat in a sunbeam. She never corrected them when they ignored me, never once asked why they never praised me, never even seemed curious. I think part of her knew, deep down, that without them, she'd just be another woman in her 30s barely scraping by. But with them? She was a star. A chosen one. The golden child. It wasn't just the attention. It was the little things. Like how they always offered to help Emily with rent when she fell behind. How they covered her overdraft fees without batting an eye. How, when I needed a cosigner for my first office space back when my business was just an idea, they told me it was too risky, that I should think smaller. But when Emily decided she wanted to try opening a boutique candle store with no prior business experience and no business plan, they handed her $5,000 like it was Monopoly money. They came to all of her birthday parties, brought champagne and gifts, made toasts that lasted for 10 minutes and ended in tears. For mine, if they remembered, they sent a text. 1 year, they forgot entirely. I sat in my apartment with a bottle of red wine and a cold grocery store cake, wondering what it would be like to have a mother who called you just to hear your voice. A father who asked how your day was. I used to think maybe if I did more, achieved more, they'd come around. I worked harder. Built more. Earned more. But nothing changed. If anything, the more successful I became, the more invisible I felt. I learned to stop telling them things. When my company was acquired and I cleared my first million, I didn't mention it. When Forbes reached out for a profile, I did the interview but never sent them the link. It was easier that way. I stopped trying to earn something they'd clearly never give me. Their love came with a set of terms and conditions I never qualified for. And still, some part of me kept watching, kept hoping, like a fool. Maybe I'd come home one day and they'd have a cake for me. Maybe they'd ask me to explain my work, really listen this time. Maybe Emily would say something, anything, that acknowledged how lopsided it all was. But that moment never came. It was just Emily, over and over again, taking up all the space, and me, fading further into the background like I'd been born to play the role of someone else's shadow. That Thanksgiving started the same way most of our family holidays did, overcooked turkey, a forced smile plastered across my face, and my mother rushing around the kitchen like she was catering a banquet for royalty, even though there were only 5 of us. The dining room was lit by a dusty chandelier that hadn't seen a deep clean in years, and the air smelled like cranberry sauce, burnt pie crust, and tension. Emily had arrived 20 minutes late, as usual, holding a bottle of cheap red wine and wearing one of those faux fur coats that made her look like she'd stepped off the set of a reality show. My mother practically squealed with joy when she walked in, taking the wine from her like it was a priceless treasure, gushing about how radiant she looked. I sat in my usual spot at the far end of the table, the one nearest the wall, half listening as Emily went on and on about her latest idea, a subscription box for pet fashion or something equally asinine. She had a new brilliant plan every month, and it never went anywhere. But my parents hung on every word like she was announcing the cure for cancer. I didn't bother contributing. I'd learned my presence wasn't necessary. I passed the stuffing, nodded where appropriate, and counted the minutes until I could leave. Then, after dessert, as everyone settled into that post-meal fog, my dad got up and disappeared into the living room. A moment later, he called out for us to come see something. Curious, and desperate for any excuse to get away from the table, I followed. He was sitting in his recliner, fiddling with the remote, trying to get his phone screen to cast onto the TV. After a few false starts and a string of quiet curses, he finally got it to work. An image of a gleaming, obsidian black Porsche 911 lit up the screen, followed by a series of high-res photos, interiors stitched in blood-red leather, chrome finishes, an engine so clean it looked surgical. "Now that's a car," he said, voice full of admiration. "This place opened just outside of Raleigh. Custom dealership. They only import the top tier." He leaned back, looking far too pleased with himself for a man who'd never even driven anything more luxurious than a used Lexus. "That's the dream right there. Someday, when I hit it big, maybe I'll walk in and drive one of these out." My mom murmured her agreement from the couch, and Emily giggled like it was charming. I stayed quiet, sipping on the glass of wine I'd poured just to get through the evening. Then, almost offhandedly, he looked over at me and added, "Not that you'd ever afford something like this, of course." "I mean, what was it again? Selling gadgets?" He chuckled to himself like he'd just landed a well-crafted joke, and my mother didn't even react. Emily smirked, biting into a second slice of pumpkin pie like she hadn't heard a thing. I remember the way my jaw tensed, how the stem of the wine glass felt slick in my fingers. I didn't say anything, didn't roll my eyes, didn't argue, didn't correct him. I'd stopped doing that a long time ago. But something shifted in me in that moment. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was colder than that. Quieter. Like a pressure valve inside me suddenly clicked into place. I realized, standing there in that living room filled with people who would never see me clearly, that I no longer gave a damn whether they ever did. I didn't want their approval anymore. I didn't need them to understand my work or to validate my choices. Their version of success, cars they couldn't afford, half-baked dreams, empty praise for mediocrity, that wasn't what I wanted. I had built something real, something solid, and I'd done it on my own. Without loans from my parents. Without any cosigns or get-out-of-debt bailouts. Without anyone believing in me but myself. That night, lying in the guest room on an air mattress that was already deflating under my back, I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything I'd worked for. The late nights, the failed pitches, the moments of doubt. I thought about how none of it mattered to them, how they'd probably forget this Thanksgiving by next week, just another blur of Emily-centered conversations and my father's passive-aggressive digs. And I thought, really thought, about what I wanted. Not what I was supposed to want. Not what they wanted me to want. But what I truly, deeply craved. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't to prove them wrong. I didn't want to rub my success in their faces or show off just to make a point. What I wanted was bigger than them. It was clarity. Independence. A life so full that their absence in it wouldn't feel like a wound. That night was the spark. The clean break. The moment I stopped shrinking myself to fit into a space they'd never make room for me in. The moment I stopped needing to be the daughter they refused to see. After that Thanksgiving, something settled into me, a quiet, determined hum that stayed in the background of everything I did. It was like a string had been pulled tight, stretching from that moment in my parents' living room to something bigger I hadn't quite touched yet. I couldn't stop thinking about that car dealership my father had practically drooled over, the way he had spoken about it with such casual reverence, like it was some untouchable symbol of success reserved for other people, not someone like me. The way he laughed, assuming I could never afford something like that. The arrogance disguised as humor. I hadn't said a word in response that night, but his comment stayed with me like a splinter under the skin, small, silent, and impossible to ignore. So, I started digging. I remembered the name of the dealership from the TV screen, Regal Auto House. The logo had been sharp and minimalistic, the kind of branding that told me it was trying very hard to appeal to a certain clientele. I went home and spent an entire Saturday combing through everything I could find about it. Public records. Licensing data. Social media accounts. Financial breadcrumbs hidden behind customer reviews and auto industry forums. The deeper I looked, the more I began to piece together a clear picture. Regal Auto House wasn't some corporate behemoth or shiny showroom backed by a billionaire's portfolio. It was an independent dealership with a curated inventory of European and high-performance cars, tucked into a business park outside Raleigh. It looked expensive on the outside, all glass panels and imported tile floors, but underneath, it had the kind of structure that was starting to show its age. They'd been around for over 20 years, run by the same man since day one, Grant Marlowe. A quiet, press-averse businessman who'd built the dealership from scratch in the early 2000s and was now, according to a couple of interviews buried in local business publications, nearing retirement. That piqued my interest. I kept digging. Their website was dated, even though the photos were clean. Their social media presence was practically non-existent, their YouTube channel had only a handful of poorly edited walkthroughs, and their blog, clearly managed by someone who had no clue about digital strategy, hadn't been updated in over a year. But what really caught my attention was their sales history. I cross-referenced inventory data with listings on third-party sites and compared them against local DMV registrations. The numbers were decent, steady even, but they weren't scaling. Regal Auto House was surviving, but it wasn't growing. In a world where luxury car markets were thriving, that was a red flag and an opportunity. Grant wasn't failing, but he was coasting. And coasting is just another way of saying you're waiting to be overtaken. That was when the idea took root. Slowly, methodically, I built a dossier, not just on the business, but on Grant himself. I looked at his history, his partnerships, even the type of language he used in interviews. He came across as a practical man, not interested in fluff or trend chasing, but someone who took pride in his legacy. He wasn't the kind of owner who would let his business crash and burn, but he also didn't seem like the type to keep pushing for expansion at his age. He was maintaining, holding the line, probably waiting for the right moment, and the right person, to pass the baton. I analyzed every angle like I was preparing for a hostile takeover. Competitive landscape. Target demographics. Operational structure. Even the CRM software they were using, which I confirmed through back-end metadata from a few embedded contact forms. Everything I found told the same story: the dealership had prestige, but not power. Brand presence, but not reach. There was no podcast, no online community, no SEO strategy. No modern storytelling to connect with the kind of buyers who didn't just want luxury cars but wanted a lifestyle wrapped around them. It was ripe for evolution. Once I had a full understanding of what I was dealing with, I started mapping out how I would approach it. I wasn't walking in to buy a car. I was walking in to buy a future. I booked a meeting under the guise of being a potential client. I crafted my email carefully, professional, direct, but curious. I mentioned I was interested in discussing a possible purchase and asked for a one-on-one appointment. Grant's assistant responded within a day, setting a time the following week. I didn't go into specifics. I wanted to look him in the eye first, to see what kind of man I was dealing with. By the time the day of the meeting rolled around, I knew more about Regal Auto House than some of its employees probably did. I knew what percentage of their customers financed versus paid in cash. I knew which models moved the fastest and which ones sat on the lot too long. I knew that Grant had an older brother who passed away 5 years ago, and that he'd never married. I knew he'd started his business with a silent partner who'd cashed out in 2010. I wasn't going in blind. I was going in with a blueprint. And underneath all that research, all that strategy, was one very personal truth: I wasn't doing this for my father's approval. I was doing it because I saw something he never would. Not just the car, not just the dealership, but the system behind it. The gears. The hidden architecture of value. And I wasn't going to stand on the outside looking in anymore. I was going to own the damn building. The day of the meeting arrived crisp and bright, with a sky so clean it looked airbrushed. I pulled into the Regal Auto House lot behind the wheel of my leased Tesla, sleek, understated, deliberate. I wasn't there to impress anyone with chrome or horsepower, I was there to take control of an asset. The building was as I expected, glass-fronted with brushed steel accents and a meticulous layout designed to project affluence, even if the sales numbers said otherwise. Every element was curated to appeal to a specific type of buyer, middle-aged professionals looking for one last ego boost or tech bros with just enough disposable income to make bad decisions, but none of it fazed me. I didn't look around like a customer. I walked in like someone who already owned the place. Inside, the showroom smelled faintly of leather and polished tile. A receptionist greeted me with professional indifference, clearly used to high-end browsers who rarely closed deals. I gave her my name, and within minutes, I was shaking hands with Grant Marlowe himself. He was tall, maybe mid-60s, with a firm grip and a tailored jacket that screamed old money trying to stay relevant. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and I could tell from the way he looked me over that he hadn't expected someone like me, young, female, unapologetically direct. I didn't dress to play a part that day. No heels, no unnecessary glam. Just a dark blazer, clean lines, and quiet confidence. If that threw him off, he didn't show it. We sat in his office, a corner space with wide windows and a walnut desk that looked like it had been polished daily for 20 years. I let him start with the small talk, the pleasantries, the subtle probing to figure out if I was just another rich kid playing dress-up. I let him get comfortable thinking he had the upper hand. And then I opened the folder. Inside was a business plan so airtight it could have been used to seal a submarine. I'd built it from scratch, every chart, every forecast, every strategy tailored specifically to the dealership's current footprint and its untapped potential. I showed him the digital landscape, how their competitors were dominating on Instagram, YouTube, even TikTok, while Regal Auto House remained practically invisible to anyone under 40. I broke down their customer retention numbers, cross-compared them to regional luxury buying trends, and illustrated exactly where and how they were bleeding value. Then I flipped the page and presented a complete restructure, marketing overhaul, content funneling, influencer partnerships, CRM migration, in-house financing optimization, and a scaled-up inventory model that included an exclusive EV segment. Grant didn't interrupt. He just sat there, nodding slowly, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, I didn't ask for his opinion. I told him my offer. Cash. No financing. No co-investors. No board. Just a single buyer, under 30, with full liquidity and a plan to modernize his legacy without dismantling its foundation. The room went quiet. I could see him doing the math behind his eyes, factoring in the tax benefits of a clean exit, the convenience of not having to drag the business through months of negotiations, and, maybe, the appeal of handing the reins to someone who actually understood the next generation of buyers. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with skepticism. It was with curiosity. He asked a few questions, probed the figures, requested verification of funds. I handed him the packet from my legal team, confirming the capital was sitting in escrow and ready to transfer on signature. He leaned back in his chair, looked at me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "Let's make a deal." The paperwork moved faster than I expected. Grant wasn't sentimental about the business. He cared about its reputation, yes, but he wasn't trying to drag out a negotiation just to protect his ego. He wanted a clean, smart exit, and I gave it to him. Within a month, the contracts were signed, the assets were transferred, and the keys to Regal Auto House were in my hand. I was 25 years old, and I had just bought a multi-million-dollar dealership outright. No partners, no loans, no one standing behind me writing checks. Just me, and the empire I was going to build. On the day the deal closed, my assistant Luke was waiting in my office, leaning against the glass wall with a coffee in one hand and a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was the first hire I'd ever made, back when my business was still run out of a co-working space and we paid for software in monthly installments because annual subscriptions felt too risky. He'd been with me through the grind, through the sleepless nights and gut-punch rejections. He knew what this moment meant. As I slid the signed agreement into the desk drawer, he looked at me and said, "So, this is revenge, huh?" I didn't even hesitate. I smiled, slow and sharp. "No," I said. "That's just a bonus." The first day I walked into Regal Auto House as its owner, the air felt different. It wasn't just mine now in theory or on paper, it was mine in every inch, every detail, every flaw waiting to be corrected. The name was still on the sign, the floor still shined, and the lineup of imported vehicles still gleamed under showroom lights, but beneath the surface, everything was about to change. I didn't show up to maintain someone else's legacy. I came to build my own, and from the moment I stepped through those doors, I started tearing down everything that wasn't aligned with that vision. My first move was to assess the team. I didn't come in swinging blindly, I observed, quietly and thoroughly, for the first week. I watched the dynamics on the floor, noted who coasted and who carried weight. I listened to how the salespeople spoke to clients, how the phones were answered, how inventory was logged and moved. It was painfully obvious which employees were here out of habit and which ones still had fire in their bellies. Some had been with Grant for years and treated their jobs like favors they were owed. They resisted change before it even arrived. One manager, during a meeting, actually said, "That's not how we've done things here." I nodded, then fired him the next morning. Dead weight had no place in what I was building. Within 2 weeks, I cleaned house. A third of the staff was let go, not out of spite, but necessity. This wasn't a museum. It was a business, and I wasn't going to apologize for demanding excellence. In their place, I hired a new team, younger, hungrier, and far more adaptable. I reached out through unconventional channels, LinkedIn, startup forums, even car influencer communities, and pulled in talent that understood digital engagement, branding, and customer psychology. Not just people who could sell a car, but people who could sell an experience. The second front was branding. Regal Auto House had the bones of prestige, but its voice was stale, disconnected from the world it claimed to serve. I partnered with a boutique design agency out of Austin, reimagined the visual identity from the ground up, and scrapped the old website entirely. We replaced it with an interactive platform that told stories, not just about the vehicles, but about the people who drove them. Testimonials, behind-the-scenes service footage, blog content curated for luxury car lovers who actually understood the value of performance and craftsmanship. Every touchpoint was redesigned to feel intentional, aspirational, and modern. The social media presence was reborn overnight. I hired a content manager who'd previously run digital strategy for a boutique hotel chain and gave her full creative autonomy under my guidance. We launched video series, short-form walkarounds, performance tests, customer delivery experiences. We brought in drone footage, slow-motion shots, and real-time Q&A sessions on Instagram Live. We didn't just sell cars, we sold a lifestyle. And the market noticed. On the operational side, I rebuilt the internal workflow from scratch. We upgraded the outdated CRM to a cloud-based system that allowed for deep behavioral tracking, automated follow-ups, and personalized lead nurturing. We optimized vendor relations, renegotiated terms with detailing services and importers, and cut costs by eliminating bloated contracts Grant had never bothered to audit. Every corner of the business was examined, trimmed, and re-engineered to run leaner and smarter. I also introduced a tiered customer loyalty program that offered concierge-level perks, pickup and drop-off services, exclusive test drive events, early access to rare models. These weren't just gimmicks. They were calculated moves to elevate the customer experience and create a brand community rather than just a client base. By the end of the third month, the numbers started speaking for themselves. Sales were up 20%, not just in volume but in average value per transaction. Clients who had previously visited once and vanished were now repeat buyers, referring friends, posting about us online without being asked. Suppliers who had once overlooked us now sent inbound inquiries, offering access to higher demand vehicles on shorter timelines. We went from being an aging dealership with a quiet reputation to a loud player in the regional luxury market, and it was only the beginning. When the State Auto Dealers Board released their quarterly update, there it was, my name listed as the youngest owner of a luxury dealership in the state. No footnote, no asterisk, no family legacy backing the title. Just me, a woman in her 20s who had taken what was supposed to be a vanity business for old men and turned it into a machine with momentum. It wasn't just about owning Regal Auto House anymore. It was about proving that I could take a dying brand, inject it with vision, and make it pulse again. Every morning I arrived before the team, and every night I left long after the showroom lights dimmed. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch it breathe, this thing I had built from someone else's rusting ambition into something alive, growing, undeniable. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling showroom windows and made every polished hood gleam like a sculpture. I had just wrapped up a meeting with a supplier rep when my assistant buzzed into my earpiece to let me know there were walk-ins on the floor, 3 of them, well-dressed, mid-50s, asking to browse the limited edition line. He didn't think anything of it until he saw the woman gesture toward the service desk like she owned the place. "You might want to come out here," he said. "It's your parents. And your sister." I didn't move right away. For a second, I stayed seated, fingers lightly pressed against the edge of my desk, feeling a quiet pressure settle into my chest like the first drop of a storm. I hadn't seen them since the Thanksgiving dinner that had lit the match. I had made no announcement about buying the dealership, no social media updates, no grand reveal. If they knew anything, they'd heard it through some random channel, or maybe not at all. But apparently they'd wandered in without realizing whose business they were standing in. When I stepped out of my office and walked into the showroom, the first person I saw was my father. He was standing in front of a matte black McLaren Artura, one of only a handful in the region, priced just north of $300,000. He circled it like a man studying a painting, one hand grazing the curve of the hood, the other in his pocket, nodding to himself in that performative way he always did when he wanted people to think he knew what he was talking about. My mother hovered a few feet behind him, clutching her designer handbag a little too tightly, eyes darting around like she wasn't quite sure where to look. Emily stood by the glass wall, arms folded, coat draped over her shoulders like she thought she might be photographed at any moment. She wore sunglasses indoors. Of course she did. I walked up to them slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, and when I was within a few feet, my father turned to glance at the voice of a nearby salesperson and did a double take. His eyes locked on mine like I had stepped out of thin air. "Madison?" He blinked, confused. "What are you doing here?" There it was. That single question, drenched in disbelief, every syllable dripping with the assumption that this place, this level of success, couldn't possibly be tied to me. That I couldn't be anything more than a guest, a visitor, an outsider looking in. I didn't blink. I smiled. Cool, calm, completely in control. "I own this place," I said. For a moment, it was like the air went still. My father froze, hands still resting on the car like he needed to touch something solid to process the information. My mother made a small sound in her throat, something between a cough and a gasp, and Emily, looked like someone had shoved a lemon wedge under her tongue. My father finally let go of the McLaren and turned toward me fully. His face turned a slow, incredulous red. "You own it?" he repeated, like he hadn't heard me correctly, or maybe just needed to hear it again to believe it. I nodded once. Then, without saying a word, I turned and walked to the reception desk. I opened the drawer, pulled out the framed ownership documentation we kept for insurance display purposes, and walked it back over to them. I held it up for them to see, my name, my title, the date of acquisition, the certification seal from the State Auto Dealers Board. Everything. My mother blinked rapidly, mouth slightly open like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite form the words. "But I thought this was Grant's," she said, her voice small. I corrected. "I bought him out. Cash. No partners. No loans." Silence. They stood there in the center of the showroom, surrounded by machines worth more than their house, and they didn't know where to look. My father looked down at the floor like it had just betrayed him. My mother shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Emily looked away, jaw tight, lips pressed together in a way that told me she was trying hard not to let something ugly slip out. "I don't understand," my father muttered finally. How could you afford something like this?" I let that question hang there, unanswered. Because it wasn't a real question, it was a reaction. A knee-jerk response from a man who had spent years believing I was less, that I would always be less, and now was being forced to see me in full focus. I didn't owe him an explanation. The success he had refused to acknowledge was now standing right in front of him, undeniable and tangible, with marble floors and showroom lights and a business that didn't just survive, it thrived. I turned to the sales floor manager, who had been watching from a respectful distance, and handed him the framed document without a word. Then I looked back at my parents and my sister, 3 stunned figures in designer coats and discount confidence, and I smiled again, politely, professionally. "If you're interested in a test drive," I said, "one of my team members will be happy to assist you." Then I walked away. I thought maybe, just maybe, that seeing the truth laid out in front of them would force something to shift. Not admiration, not even pride, but acknowledgement. A pause. A moment where they saw me not through the lens of their dismissiveness, but through reality. But I had underestimated how deep their denial ran. Because instead of silence becoming recognition, it became resistance. The next day, my mother called. Her voice was tight, brittle in that way she used when she was trying to keep control of a conversation that was already slipping away. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't ask about the business. She didn't want to understand how I'd pulled it off or what it meant for my future. Instead, she opened with, "That whole performance yesterday, that was cold, Madison. You made us feel like strangers." As if I hadn't been treated like one my entire life. She said I was distant, emotionally closed off, hard to talk to. She said I embarrassed them by flaunting something I could have shared in a kinder way, as if I owed them softness after years of neglect. I let her speak until she ran out of steam, then ended the call without comment. There was nothing left to say. A few hours later, Emily chimed in with a string of texts. She started with fake casual, "So, that was intense," before shifting tone like she always did when things didn't center her. She called me dramatic, said I was obsessed with proving something, accused me of holding grudges and blowing things out of proportion. "You've always been like this," she wrote. "So focused on being right that you push everyone away." As if all the years of her soaking up praise and support while I was treated like a placeholder had never happened. As if her silence hadn't been complicity. As if my success wasn't something earned but a tantrum thrown too well. But the worst was my father's email. It came the next morning. Long, rambling. Equal parts patronizing and absurd. He opened by expressing his disappointment in my behavior and said I had disrespected the family by asserting myself the way I had. "Success means nothing without humility," he wrote, as though the man who once laughed in my face about affording a car I now owned the title to had any claim to humility. He demanded an apology for the tone I used and insisted I had hurt them by acting superior. He talked about how families are supposed to support one another, about how it wasn't too late to make amends. It was so loaded with hypocrisy that I didn't know whether to laugh or rage. Instead, I wrote back one sentence. "I owe you nothing." And then I blocked all of them. Phone. Email. Socials. Every point of contact. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't send a dramatic farewell. I simply closed the door, finally, fully, and for good. Because I wasn't building a life that required their pride anymore. I didn't need their approval to validate the empire I had created with my own hands. I had spent too many years shaping myself around the jagged edges of their indifference, trimming my ambition into something more palatable for people who were never going to be proud of me unless I made myself small enough to fit their idea of who I should be. But I wasn't small anymore. I wasn't invisible. And I didn't need their recognition to know what I'd become. I had my own pride now. And that was enough. 1 year after I took ownership of Regal Auto House, the numbers spoke louder than any validation I could have begged for in my youth. Sales had nearly doubled. Our client list included professional athletes, tech entrepreneurs, and collectors with net worths that required private wealth managers. The systems I had implemented ran clean, efficient, and scalable. So I scaled. The second location opened on the west side of Charlotte, in an industrial space I converted into a high-gloss, high-tech showroom. Instead of copying the first, I adapted it, sleeker branding, smarter use of space, and a layout optimized for customer flow based on behavioral heat maps we generated from tracking foot traffic. We installed an immersive showroom experience, virtual test drives, interactive design tables, and a private lounge with catered espresso service and biometric secured keys. The launch weekend alone brought in over $4 million in new sales. Within 3 months, the waitlist for certain models was longer than most dealerships had inventory. 6 months later, I opened the third location, this time in Atlanta. It was bold, loud, and unapologetically high-end. We hosted invite-only grand opening events that drew influencers, racing professionals, and media attention from every automotive publication that mattered. My face appeared on billboards across major highways, not smiling or posing, but standing in front of the brand I had built, arms folded, eyes forward, daring anyone to ask how I got here. And people did ask. In the industry, my name started to mean something. Magazine profiles, podcasts, guest panels, I didn't chase the spotlight, but I didn't avoid it either. I spoke plainly about what I built, how I built it, and why I didn't wait for permission. My story was clean and sharp, no family inheritance, no spouse and private equity, no corporate safety net. Just grit, execution, and relentless clarity. That combination made me a problem for people who relied on pedigree over performance. When I was invited to speak at the National Auto Dealer Leadership Conference in Chicago, it felt full circle in a way I didn't try to overanalyze. I was the youngest speaker on the roster, and one of the only women. I didn't let that intimidate me. I crafted my keynote with surgical precision, built around data, growth strategy, and the quiet power of taking up space where no one expects you to stand. The ballroom was massive, ornate ceilings, white tablecloths, and a crowd that skewed older, more traditional, and almost entirely male. I stepped onto that stage without hesitation and delivered my keynote to a full room. No stumbles. No filler. Just facts, vision, and proof. When I finished, I received a standing ovation that lasted longer than I expected. But I saw them before the lights had fully shifted, 3 familiar faces in the front row. My father. My mother. And Emily. They hadn't told me they were coming. They hadn't reached out, hadn't asked for tickets or offered congratulations. They'd just appeared, front and center, like they had always been supportive, like they had always believed. My father was dressed in a crisp suit he had no business wearing, and the way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, chin up, I knew what was coming before he stood up. After the applause, as the crowd thinned out and conference staff started preparing for the next speaker, he approached me backstage. My mother hovered just behind him, smiling like she was posing for a holiday card, and Emily stood off to the side, flipping her hair like it might matter. My father stepped in close, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. I've been thinking, he said, with the way your business is expanding, maybe it's time you had someone with experience helping manage operations. Someone who knows how to handle logistics and scale, someone like me. There was no trace of irony. No humility. He said it like he was offering me a gift, like I should be grateful for the chance to finally let him in. I looked at him, not with anger or even disbelief, but with the kind of calm that only comes from finally, truly understanding who someone is. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I didn't ask what he thought he'd contributed to deserve a place in what I'd built. I just said one word. No. I didn't offer context. I didn't soften the blow. I didn't negotiate. And the look in his eyes told me that, for the first time, he truly understood that he held no power here. Not anymore. He blinked, taken aback, and tried to laugh it off, as if I was being cute or playful. But when I turned and walked away without another word, leaving him standing there with his pitch hanging useless in the air, there was nothing left for him to do but watch me go. Success didn't make them proud. It made them quiet. And I preferred it that way. After that conference, they disappeared as suddenly as they'd shown up. No more emails. No more surprise visits. No half-baked attempts at reconnection wrapped in manipulation. They slipped back into the shadows where they had kept me for most of my life, only this time, they weren't in control of the silence, I was. I didn't chase them. I didn't check in. I had spent enough years trying to earn their attention, trying to translate my ambition into something they could recognize as worthy. Now, I let the silence sit between us like a permanent border. Then I started hearing things. Not through direct channels, they never reached out again. But people talk, especially in communities where pride gets mistaken for privacy. It started with my dad. After nearly 3 decades at his company, they let him go. Downsizing, restructuring, whatever term corporate uses when they want to clear out the high-salary dead weight. He hadn't kept up with changes in the industry, hadn't bothered to learn the new systems or adapt to the digital shifts. He thought tenure would protect him, thought competence could replace competence. It didn't. One Friday, he walked into the office with a travel mug and walked out with a box of his things. No severance. No second chance. The house was the next to go. I found out through a real estate blog I followed for investment leads, an alert for a foreclosure filing on a 5-bedroom colonial in a suburban neighborhood that looked achingly familiar. The photos confirmed it. The house I'd grown up in. The driveway where I'd taught myself to ride a bike. The kitchen where my mother had ignored every school award I ever brought home. Gone. Bank-owned. Listed well below market value after months of missed mortgage payments. They hadn't even tried to rent it out to stay afloat. Pride, I guessed. The same pride that had kept them from ever asking for help, even if they'd been desperate enough to want it. Emily was next. She'd bounced from job to job after college, never landing long enough to build anything, and somewhere between two failed wellness ventures and a luxury candle brand that flamed out within weeks, she had landed at a mid-level PR firm that tolerated her more than they valued her. But the economy turned, layoffs started rolling, and she was one of the first to go. No goodbye party. No recommendations. Just an email and a security escort out the building. She posted vague inspirational quotes on social media for a while, all about starting new chapters and finding grace in hard times, but the captions got shorter, then vanished entirely. My mother took a job at a retail outlet just outside the city. Someone from my Charlotte dealership recognized her on a weekend trip. She was behind the register at a discount department store, wearing a name tag and folding clearance sweaters while some teenager argued over expired coupons. She'd dyed her hair darker, maybe trying not to be seen, but there was no mistaking her posture, shoulders tight, back stiff, the same cold mask she used to wear whenever she was about to deliver one of her dismissive "we're not discussing this" statements at the dinner table. Now she handed out receipts to strangers. None of them reached out. Not once. No apology. No olive branch. No admission of how cruel they'd been or how wrong they'd gotten it. But I knew they watched. I started getting notifications from anonymous accounts that would view my dealership's Instagram stories within minutes of posting. Our security cameras picked up the same car, an old, dull silver sedan with worn plates, driving past one of the lots on early weekend mornings, always slowing down near the front but never pulling in. Staff eventually learned to ignore it. I didn't bother asking them to investigate. I already knew. They had become spectators to a life they once dismissed as frivolous. They used to call my work selling stuff. Now they drove past my showrooms like haunted tourists visiting a monument they never helped build. Ghosts, lingering on the periphery of a world that had left them behind. I didn't pity them. Pity still required a thread of connection. What I felt was distance. Clean, wide, and permanent. The kind of distance you don't try to close. The kind you respect because it protects everything you've built. They had their chances. Over and over again, they had their chances to be something more than critics and skeptics and smug voices in the background. But they chose mockery. They chose silence. And now, they were living in the echo of it. Watching. Quiet. Forgotten. The letter came on an ordinary Thursday morning, tucked in with the usual stack of invoices, vendor catalogs, and tax notifications. It was handwritten, addressed in familiar cursive, and bore a return address I didn't recognize, some apartment complex in a less expensive suburb 2 hours from where they used to live. No return name, just M. Lane, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw the slant of the handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it, part of me debating whether it was even worth the effort. Inside, the letter unfolded in soft, looping ink, written in my mother's usual overly formal tone, the kind she used when pretending everything was fine. She opened with a line about hoping I was well, as if we were old acquaintances who'd simply drifted apart. The first paragraph was heavy with nostalgia, a curated list of memories from my childhood, my first spelling bee, a camping trip I barely remembered, a reference to the laugh I used to have when I got excited. It was less a recollection and more a carefully engineered attempt to create warmth where none remained. Then came the guilt. She talked about how hard things had been lately. How they never imagined life turning out this way. How your father still believes in structure and dignity, even if he doesn't know how to say it, and how Emily has been struggling, but she's trying. There was a note about the foreclosure, carefully worded as "we've relocated and downsized," and a reference to my success that avoided specifics. She called me strong but never used the word proud. She said they had made mistakes, but not once did she use the word sorry. Not once did she say they had failed me. Just vague nods to how family can drift and how she hopes one day we can sit down and talk through things. It was a letter soaked in guilt but bone dry on accountability. I didn't write back. A week later, Emily called. The number popped up unexpectedly, and for a brief moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity won. Her voice was familiar but thinner than I remembered, like life had taken some of her volume. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "They're struggling," she said, as if that alone should have meant something. I said nothing. She sighed, audibly irritated, and continued. "Mom's working double shifts. Dad's barely scraping by doing delivery gigs. They can't keep up. They're drowning." I waited. Then she said it. You could help. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just a slow exhale of recognition that we had finally arrived at the inevitable moment. That's not my concern, I said, calmly. Evenly. Without a flicker of hesitation. There was a beat of silence on the line, like she wasn't sure she heard me right. Then the tone shifted. You know, she snapped, I used to think you just needed space. But you're just cruel. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the irony of hearing her say that, after all the years they spent invalidating me, mocking me, dismissing my work as some childish side project, was almost too rich to take seriously. No, I said, my voice flat. It's not cruelty. It's consequence. Another pause. She didn't hang up right away. I think she expected me to soften. Expected me to backpedal, to compromise, to let a decade of pain be erased by a few months of discomfort on their end. But I didn't. I had built my life from the ground up, stone by stone, while they sat in comfort and watched, never lifting a hand or offering a word of encouragement. And now that the ground beneath them had given way, they came crawling, not to make peace, but to claim rescue. But I was not their lifeline. I let the silence hang long enough for her to feel its full weight. Then I ended the call. And blocked the number. Again. Long after the dust had settled and the noise of my family's chaos had faded into the background, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing, support that didn't come with strings. Recognition that wasn't tied to blood or guilt or expectation. It came in the form of Grant Marlowe, the man who had once owned the dealership I now ran, the man who, unlike my father, had looked at me during that first meeting and recognized capability, not inconvenience. After the sale was finalized, Grant didn't vanish. He didn't micromanage from the sidelines either. What he did was far more valuable, he made himself available. At first, it was just a few follow-up calls, brief check-ins to see how things were running. I kept him updated out of respect, not obligation. He was surprised when I sent him the first quarterly report showing a 20% sales spike, and even more surprised when I invited him to walk the new Charlotte location a month before it opened. But he showed up, shook my hand like we were equals, and listened, really listened, when I laid out the expansion strategy. That was when things shifted. He saw that I wasn't just managing what he'd left behind, I was building beyond it. Not burning his legacy down, but elevating it. He started calling more often, not to offer advice unsolicited, but to ask how I was solving problems he remembered struggling with. We started meeting for coffee twice a month, usually early mornings, where we'd sit outside in the quiet before the city woke up and trade thoughts on team management, capital reinvestment, and supplier psychology. He never acted like a superior. Never treated my age as a handicap. He talked to me like a peer. One morning over black coffee and a shared plate of burnt toast, he said, I underestimated you. I don't mind admitting that. But I'm glad you proved me wrong. That was the first time I heard someone who mattered say they were glad I had succeeded. Grant had connections I didn't even know existed. Old-school handshake deals. Personal relationships with suppliers, distributors, brand executives. He opened those doors for me without asking for anything in return. Not ownership. Not equity. Not credit. Just quiet confidence that I would carry the weight of that access with purpose. He introduced me to senior board members of performance car brands who typically wouldn't even take meetings with independents. He walked me into events where I was the only woman under 40, and made the introductions not as favors, but as endorsements. This is Madison Lane, he'd say. She's not just the real deal, she's the future. I remember one night at a closed-door networking dinner in Denver. The room was filled with manufacturers, private investors, and a few auto journalists whose names were whispered like currency. I was seated beside Grant, the youngest person in the room by at least a decade, and when the VP of a luxury brand started asking questions about expansion and risk management, Grant leaned back, gestured to me, and said, "Ask her. I've seen what she's done. She knows this business better than most of us ever did." And they listened. Not because I demanded it, but because the work I had done, the numbers, the strategy, the execution, spoke before I did. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't overlooked, minimized, or explained away. I was in the room because I had earned my place there. And the people around me saw it. It felt like fresh air after years of holding my breath. Grant became more than a mentor. He became a kind of quiet presence in my life that balanced everything I had built alone. He never pushed too far, never pried. When I told him about what had happened with my family, not in detail, but enough, he nodded slowly and said, "Sometimes people don't see you until someone else shows them how." I didn't need his validation. But I respected it. It came from experience. From a man who'd built his own empire in a different era, who understood the cost of being the one who takes the risk while everyone else waits to benefit. Together, we built something stronger than a business network. We built credibility. Not inherited. Not inherited. Not gifted. Earned. Every conversation, every introduction, every deal I closed in rooms where I was once unwelcome, those were bricks in a foundation I was finally allowed to stand on. I didn't just feel seen. I felt respected. 3 years after the day I first walked into Regal Auto House as its owner, everything had changed. Not overnight. Not in some movie montage way. But piece by piece, deal by deal, hour by hour of work that no one ever saw. I had earned every inch of the ground I stood on. The fourth dealership was already in development, this time on the Gulf Coast, where the market was high income and underserved. The media had caught on months earlier, local outlets first, then national ones. Headlines called me the next big name in luxury automotive retail, and profiles ran in business magazines, featuring staged photos of me standing against the backdrop of my showrooms, confident and direct, my name now synonymous with innovation in an industry still dominated by men twice my age. It had become routine by then, seeing my name in press releases, walking into leadership summits where people now stood when I entered the room, receiving calls from companies that once ignored my emails. It didn't shock me anymore, but I didn't take it for granted either. Every day still began early, still required strategy, still demanded clarity. But the battles had changed. I wasn't fighting to be seen. I wasn't clawing for scraps of approval. I was building forward, not looking back. One evening, during a late drive back from a meeting at the new site, I took the longer route home. The highway curved through the edge of the city where my first billboard had gone up. I hadn't planned to pass it, but traffic pulled me in that direction. And there it was, illuminated against the fading dusk, set high above the intersection where 3 lanes converged. My face. My brand. My name in bold lettering next to the slogan we had crafted together, clean, sharp, declarative. It wasn't just a billboard. It was a landmark. I pulled off onto the shoulder and turned off the engine, letting the quiet settle around me as headlights whirred past in both directions. I sat there looking at it, not as a milestone, not even with pride, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes when you've climbed past the noise and find yourself looking at the life you built from ground zero. And then, without warning, that Thanksgiving memory came flickering back, the dull sound of my father's laugh, the glint of the dealership's luxury cars on the screen, the offhand, smug joke, "Not that you'd ever afford something like this." That moment used to burn inside me, used to push me, shape me, make me dig deeper to prove something they refused to see. But now, sitting in my car, eyes on the skyline, it washed over me like old water. Cold. Meaningless. Distant. They were wrong about me. Every single one of them. About who I was, about what I was capable of, about what my work meant and what I could achieve. They had spent years crafting a narrative in which I was less important, less worthy, less real. But I had dismantled that story with action, rebuilt my identity brick by brick without their permission or participation. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I had stopped needing their correction. Because the truth no longer lived in their opinions. It lived in the 4 showrooms, in the teams I had built, in the customers I had served, and in the empire that had risen in the exact place they said I'd never stand. That was the final realization. It wasn't that they were wrong. That had already been proven again and again. It was that it no longer mattered. Not the oversight. Not the mockery. Not the silence. Their voices had become background noise in a life they no longer touched. I wasn't living in opposition to their disbelief anymore. I wasn't performing for their recognition or validation. I had become what I always knew I was capable of being, not in spite of them, but entirely without them. They didn't matter. Not anymore. And maybe they never truly did.